And the Progressive Caucus, when it held 6 forums, including often coordinated by the Honda staffer who was going to go on our trip before the State Department intervened, they came out of those forums and they did a briefing and a report directly to President Obama. And they said, we recommend 20% military spending, 80% non-military, including humanitarian assistance and development aid. And President Obama came back with a supplemental package providing for, in Afghanistan, U.S. spending 90% military, and pushed it through, and that is operative. That is operative today. And how did they get it through? Well, one of the ways that the White House got it through is they called up first-termers in Congress. And they said, well, you and we know that you are the most vulnerable members on the whole. You got to go out for your first re-election. And we hear you may not vote for the supplemental. And if you don't vote for the supplemental, we don't know you next year when you want help for your re-election. And that helped push through the supplemental package. So how does that break down? Well, I don't want to mislead you, because you might conclude that 10% of U.S. aid in Afghanistan, after all, the U.S. is spending what? $5 billion a month in Afghanistan? I wouldn't want to mislead you to think that 10% of that money is going to humanitarian and development aid. Because actually, when you look at the figures and you do the research, and my friend Reese Ehrlich, who wrote a piece for the San Francisco Chronicle after we were both in Afghanistan a couple of months ago, documented the actual amount of U.S. aid money that is reaching its intended targets in Afghanistan, the intended recipients and beneficiaries, is between 10 and 20%. So you do the math. What is 10 or 20% of 10%? It's a couple of pennies on the dollar. And that helps us understand I'm not talking about the smoke blowing and the rhetoric and the flowery oratory. I'm talking about the priorities of the U.S. government in Afghanistan. And when we talk about corruption, yes, there's a lot of corruption, but I remember what one of the Afghan officials told Reese when he was asked about corruption of the Afghan government. He said, well, USAID is skimming off or creating skim-offs for other entities of between 80 and 90% of every dollar. We don't do any worse than that. When the money is coming back to the Beltway bandits in Northern Virginia and the NGOs and the for-profit entities. And this is the way it's working. Well, it's not rocket science about how you get aid to people. There's something called the Aga Khan Foundation in Afghanistan. For decades has been doing that effectively. There's something called the National Solidarity Program, believe it or not, partly funded through the World Bank and through the Afghan Ministry of Rural Rehabilitation. And the National Solidarity Program is getting money to tens of thousands of villages in Afghanistan with transparency. And the money is noted on the wall. The money is noted on the wall of the mosque in the town. So there's transparency. And you know what? Those projects that are being built as a result of the National Solidarity Program, they are not getting blown up. They are not getting burned down. Why is that? Because that aid is not an adjunct of U.S. military operations. You know, when Cooper Anderson and the rest of them show you how these Marines and U.S. officials are trying to help people, they just happen to have the camera crews right where the Marines and the Army are in military operations. And we heard that again and again. Complaints from NGOs that the aid follows the military activity. And the message to parts of the country, the provinces that are not involved so much in the military insurgency and the fighting is, we don't have the priority for you because you don't have military operations going there. We don't have military priorities there, so it's an adjunct. The aid is an adjunct. It's a smoke-blowing operation. It's a PR operation. It's part of, you've probably heard this term, counterinsurgency program. And this spectrum, you want it along the grid, you want more counterinsurgency or counterterrorism. Choose your particular way to wage a war that is not about helping people in Afghanistan at all. And the next day after we were at this refugee camp in Afghanistan, we went to the heavily fortified office of Mohammed Zia, who's the Minister of Rural Rehabilitation. He has the somewhat backhanded distinction of being considered perhaps the only minister in the Afghan government who's not corrupt, and he certainly was quite intelligent in the discourse. But he said, the people, we asked him about the refugee camp there, he said, no, they should go home. They should go back to where they live, in Helmand province. And we said, well, they said they were promised land up here. He said, no, nobody promised them land. Well, they said they had nothing to go home to. Mr. Khan said that all he wanted was for somebody to give him a little piece of land and dig a well, and he'd do the rest because he's a farmer. He knew how to grow things. That's what he wants to be able to do. But he said after the bombs fell, then the Taliban came through and said, will you join up? And he didn't want to do that either. So he came to Kabul. And then I asked a question that got a very interesting answer. I asked Mr. Zia, well, we all have heard that agriculture is key to the future of Afghanistan. So what do you think, would it be helpful if the Afghan government imposed protective import tariffs on agricultural goods? And for 5 minutes as he responded, you'd think he was channeling Naomi Klein and Noam Chomsky. He talked about how the Afghan farmer does not have a chance unless the government is able to, through strict protective import tariffs, protect their livelihoods, their capacity to grow and market and sell in a reasonable way their agricultural goods. Unless Afghan farmers are protected in that way, he said, they don't have a chance. And then I asked, is there a government that you can tell me about in the world that is standing shoulder to shoulder with your government in support of your right to impose those protective import tariffs on agricultural products? And he said, no, not one. I said, well, that must mean inclusive of Washington. The U.S. government is not willing to no, he said no. He says they don't believe that we have a right to protect our own farmers. Now what does that tell us? That tells us the same thing that Goljuma's story tells us. That of all the priorities that are operative in Washington in policy towards Afghanistan, helping people of that country is so far down you can barely see it. I want to get very political about what we are up against in the United States. And I was elected as an Obama delegate to the Democratic National Convention. I am still very happy that John McCain is not president.